Grace and peace. Welcome back to Point of Contact, a program that brought to you by Covenant City Church. In my own Christian journey, I think I learned as much from discussing issues about Christianity with fellow believers than I did reading books. And these conversations can be hard to come by nowadays because of the pandemic and we can't meet people and all really. But we at CCC feel like we can do the next best thing. Right? Point of Contact is a program where CCC would invite faithful brothers and sisters in Christ who may not be in CCC or minister in other churches in other areas, but they do have some pretty insightful things to say about topics that are hopefully interesting for you guys. And this week, I am joined again by Mr. Brian Cox for part 2 of our conversation. Sir Brian is a former head of school in the Pelita Harapan school system here in Indonesia. He is an experienced educator and international speaker, and my own personal mentor. How are you doing, Mr. Brian?
I'm well, thanks. How are you, Sam?
Not bad, not bad. I can't complain. So just to recap for you guys, if you haven't seen the previous episode, in our last discussion, we talked about education more generally and how the Bible places the primary responsibility of educating the child on the parents. And we talked a lot about how and what we should do as parents to our kids and how we can adapt and accommodate to our child as he matures and changes in his learning habit, right? So if that interests you at all, shameless plug, check it out on our YouTube page. It is now available if you're interested. That being said, in this discussion, Mr. Brian and I will be talking about and will be addressing reality, an issue that plagues, I would say, the majority of the homes that are listening today, right? That for the most part, parents are away from their children most of the time during the work hours, at least. And this is a very much new development, recent in history, right? Like, because back in the old days, parents would simply bring their kids to work and teach them their trade. But now children are away from their families from a very young age and are spending time being educated by other people. Okay, so I guess we can start with this question, Mr. Brian. So what are some of the perspectives on the purpose of sending children out to be educated by someone who is not their parents, right? And what are they supposed to learn there?
Good. These are deep and complex questions, and probably we need hours and hours of discussion, but we can skate across the surface of these things. For many people, the question becomes, which school shall we choose for our children? And it may relate to geography, it may relate to nearness, it may relate to faith or foundation, it may relate to the fame of the school or whatever. But I think we need to think very deeply about what education is and therefore what role schools play. I have critical questions that I ask about anything in life. Those questions will be why, where, who, what, how. Why educate is a critical question. Where does that education take us? What are the plans? What are the outcomes? Who is involved in that? Who's the recipient? Who are the people who deliver that? What is the nature of that education and how does it actually take place? So I deliberately discipline myself to ask those questions about every particular issue. And we need to ask those questions when we're considering a school. Why do I want to educate? Where do I want that education to go? Who is going to do it? Who is going to receive it? What is it? And how is it delivered? And we all outsource. Well, most of us outsource the education of our kids to some sort of institution now. It's a global phenomena. And as Sam said, this is a recent thing. It's probably in the last 100 years that this has become the norm. But the one thing we can't outsource, or the two things we can't outsource, are the responsibility that we have for our kids and the authority that we have in regard to our kids. In other words, when we outsource to a school, we're not handing over all of our responsibility for raising our kids or all of the authority to raise our kids. And the problem is that in many places around the world, governments presume that education is a government responsibility in which parents have no role to take in that process. More generally, I think we make some poor assumptions about schooling. We tend to live compartmentalized lives is the first generalization. In other words, we have family, we have church, we have school, we have career, we have recreation, and somehow we think we can function differently and separately in each of those things. So school, we simply say, is a compartment. So we put our kids in there, education done. The second thing I think, the second presumption we make that I think is false is that we presume that we can judge things by our experience only. In other words, this is the sort of school I went to, so I send my kids to this sort of school, they'll be dealt with well. I think as Christians, we need to think a lot more deeply than that. We need to think a lot more deeply about how do I understand the scriptures in terms of the development of our children? How do I understand God's purposes and his desires for the stewarding of my children? And the third thing I think we presume is that education is neutral. In other words, a school's a school's a school. Math is math. History is history. Doesn't matter where you go. All that might be different is that there might be a higher quality here and a lower quality here. So those three presumptions, I think, need challenging. And I think we challenge them biblically. And if we look at, for example, Paul writing to the Colossians, I think if you want to understand the importance of education, I think we read Paul's letter to the Colossians. It's brilliant in terms of how everything hangs together in Christ, that all knowledge and wisdom is to be found there. It talks about how everything is created from him, for him, through him, to him, and so on. It then talks about how, in typical Pauline letter style, it says, here's what's happened to us, here's what Christ has done with us, therefore we celebrate that, and then this is how we live. So, to read Colossians in terms of education, I think, is a critical issue. But Colossians 1, he says, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, right? For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So that smashes this whole idea of compartmentalism. It's not possible to live our life in a compartment, right? All things, all things, all things. So there's no compartments there. We tend towards creating compartments, but that's a false way of living our lives. And neither can education be neutral. And I think it's really important that we consider what that neutrality, the presumption that people make about life, so certain aspects of life being neutral and certain aspects of education being neutral. And let's just have a look again biblically at the issue of 1 Corinthians 1:18. So what does 1 Corinthians 1:18 tell us? For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it's the power of God. In other words, what we've got is one event. And the majority of the world would say, was there a person called Jesus Christ? Yes. Was he crucified? Yes. In other words, the fact of the existence of Christ is generally accepted by all people. But there's two different stories, right? One of them says it's folly to those who are perishing. In other words, I look at the cross and it's stupid. If I have not had my mind enlightened, it's stupid. It's foolishness. However, if I look at it from the point of view of I have been saved, it is now the power of God. So I come to two different conclusions and I see two different perceived purposes. So every single fact, every single piece of data has to have a context. And if we want to, we could go through things like James 3, where he talks about wisdom and what is that. There's the whole history of wisdom literature in the Old Testament. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is neutral. And I think we need to understand that and to realize that every single school has a story in which its education takes place. Nothing is neutral. And education is not neutral. And, 2 weeks ago, it was the celebration around the world of the Holocaust, what happened in the 30s and 40s in Europe. And we had one nation wanting to wipe out another nation. And one of the things that came out of that is this sort of statement from a Jewish person who was in a concentration camp. And this was his view about education. He said, "I'm a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no person should witness: gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and babies shot by high school and college graduates. So I'm suspicious of education." He goes on to say, "Help your children to become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, or educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they serve to make our children more human." That's an incredibly powerful statement. And it's obvious from that things cannot be neutral. Simply being educated does not guarantee that we will be positive human beings. Simply having skills and information and data and even knowledge. So there's always going to be an ethical, moral aspect to education. The other thing we need to understand, I think, is that every school, let's fundamentally make this point. Every school has a particular narrative. That narrative may be determined by the culture, right? So, for example, in North Korea, what would be the culture that drives the educational narrative? Well, in North Korea, the culture would be compliance, right? And so the educational narrative will be driven by compliance. We must be obedient to our dictator. In the USA, for example, what would be the culture? Well, there's a strong sense of individualism in United States culture. There's a strong sense of economic prosperity in United States culture. And it's interesting to see how this plays out. For example, if you compare scholarship processes in US universities and Australian universities. If you want a scholarship into American university, you gain it by being highly intelligent and being competitive. If you want to gain a scholarship into an Australian university, it's a more egalitarian approach that says, we will give you a scholarship if you cannot afford this education. So there's a different narrative there. And every single educational institution has this different narrative. And so if we take the US individualism, out of that has come standards, grades, competitions, winners of spelling bees and all that sort of stuff. Try that in a place like South Africa and there'll be no success whatsoever, because the South African culture says we don't do things individually, we do things together. So if you set up a competition for kids in South African schools, they won't take part, because the bigger cultural pressure is that we help one another, and if there's a race, if it's let's get to the end of this race and you'll get some reward, they'll take each other's hands and they'll run together, because the culture says we do things together. So even nationally or internationally, there's a culture that determines the narrative. Key question then becomes, what's the culture for us understanding education from a biblical Christian viewpoint? What might some of the important things be if we're trying to say education of our kids needs to take place in the context of biblical Christian understanding?
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting how you put education not only as simply the acquisition of knowledge and skills, right? But
Yep.
in a very fundamental way, the way in which we humans are shaped to be the ethical, moral, intellectual being that
Yeah.
we are. Um, but I'll push back, okay,
Good.
just so that this is a little fun, right? That growing up, at least, maybe my experience is reflective of the experience of many Jakartans or Indonesians. Education was always seen to be a means to an end,
Yeah.
right? It qualifies you and it puts you into a certain strata that puts you in a better position to be successful and to do whatever it is that you want. And along the lines of that is, academic performance becomes a matter of prestige
Yeah.
amongst not only students, but I think even more amongst the parents. I think they care more about it than
Yeah.
most of us do, to be honest. And so when we look for, which is the second part of our question earlier, right? Like when we look, or at least if I had a kid, and if I look for a place for them to be educated, I want them to be put in the best position possible to not only develop ethically as a human being, but in my mind, I'm paying this school tens of thousands of dollars so my kid has a shot to go to Harvard, right? Not so that they become, you know what I mean, like um, amicable and godly human beings, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But don't fall into the trap of thinking it's either or. I think it's essential that every child in a Christian family is educated to the highest standard possible. Now, just because I'm saying that has to take place in a narrative, in a story, in an ethical and moral framework, does not mean, therefore, the academic standard drops off. It's not either or. It's both and. It is making sure that when we look at the guy who's writing about the prisoner of war camp in the Holocaust, he's saying here are highly educated people, but they're using their education in an immoral fashion because they haven't understood how important human identity and human value is. Now, just because it, it's not a matter of there is only a certain amount of time, and we've either got to teach academics or we've got to teach ethics, morality, and how to serve God appropriately. Those things happen together. Those things happen at exactly the same time, and I think. I mean, the question, your statement about maybe parents are looking to get their kids into Harvard. My question would be why? You see, I'll come back to my fundamental questions: why, where, who, how, what. Why would you want to get your child into Harvard? Well, it's status, right? So that they may get a better job, so that they may have a bigger house. And there's nothing wrong with a good job and a big house and all of those things. Nothing wrong with that. But is that the most important thing in the world? Can you actually have a good job and be ethical, moral, and God honoring? Answer is yes. And so you can combine those two things. I think the other thing that happens if education is seen as this striving to reach the highest point in a university or a school, maybe we haven't been Augustinian enough. You know, or the Augustinian idea that that we love the most important things and therefore we order our loves correctly. I mean, and if we look at, let me show you something else that that might help us here. John Ruskin, who was a philosopher, Christian, creative person at the turn of the century, he says the entire object of true education is to make people not merely do the right things, but enjoy the right things. Not merely industrious, but to love industry. Basically, he's talking about, and he goes on to say, I've skipped the slide, not just to, not merely to learn, but to love knowledge, not merely to know purity, but to love purity, not merely to know about justice, but to hunger and thirst for justice. In other words, can you see how the narrative becomes not just intellectual, but how does that intellect affect the way that I live my life? And to actually love learning and to love knowledge and to love understanding and to love wisdom is a great thing. Neil Postman wrote a book called The End of Education. And that was a sort of a play on words. He was saying education is coming to an end because we're treating it in such a formalized, legalistic way that kids hate it. But he also meant the end of education, as in what are the goals or what's the end purpose of education? So it's a very interesting book. But you see, after people like Ruskin, we had John D. Rockefeller come along in the US, 1900. They established the General Education Board. And he says, I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers. And so education became utilitarian. It became, how do I get skilled people to do jobs? And the more skilled they are, the better jobs they will have. And he helped in that process by donating 130 million to what was called the General Education Board in 1902. That's equivalent to $4 billion now, because he saw that the most important thing was to have a nation of workers. And so, you know, education was actually capped. And as I said, this changed the whole view of education. And because we're globalized people, we suffer from that thinking now. And so we see education as a compartment that says, how do we get a job? And so we don't see the value of learning and knowledge and understanding and wisdom for its own sake and for the love of doing that. And that will get us a job. We will be very well qualified for a job because we will also understand the dignity of human beings and want to do things that will help that. But we mustn't fall into this trap of thinking, well, education is simply for my kid to get the best job to get, and so on. That there must be a more contributory factor. By the way, let me show you this because I think it's quite fascinating, and I think somebody in Indonesia should actually challenge this. I did a little bit of research some time ago about what was the plan in 1945 about education for Indonesian people, and it really is quite fascinating that in the constitution itself it talks about that we want a national education system that will strengthen the people's faith and piety to God the Almighty. That's a pretty interesting statement. Strengthen moral character, enhancing the intellectual capacity of the nation. And then it talks about a conscious and well-planned effort in creating a learning environment and a learning process so that learners will be able to develop their full potential for acquiring spiritual and religious strengths, develop self-control, personality, intelligence, morals, and the noble character and skills that one needs for him, herself, for the community, for the nation, and for the state. That's brilliant. That is absolutely brilliant. And if that actually took place, imagine how stunning the nation of Indonesia would be. And successive education ministers need to sort of go back to the origins of that and say, well, what's happened? Why aren't we doing that? So I think that's one of the best statements I've ever seen in relation to the purposes of education of a nation. So it's quite brilliant.
Yeah, yeah, and I completely agree with you. Hopefully, that was practiced more than it was an ideal that hopefully would come to fruition one day. And yeah, I definitely see that, and that's definitely, I think, how my own thinking about education has been shaped, right? Because this is a simple example. When my parents call me in university, for example, they didn't ask, what did you learn, what was interesting, or even like since school, what questions do you have? They asked, what were your grades? Did
Yeah,
you pass?
yeah.
Right? Right. And if I said yes, that's it. Like all of their fears and all of their anxieties kind of like were released at that point.
Yeah, it's a terribly let me say it again quite clearly. There is absolutely nothing wrong with doing well. There is absolutely nothing wrong with excellence in education. All I'm trying to say is let's not compartmentalize that into academic achievement, and somehow our ethical, moral view of life will catch up with that at some point. I think, along with teaching to a high academic standard, we must be encouraging our kids to engage with that. In other words, why have you been gifted with those abilities? So that you might engage in the world in a positive way. And we have to teach that. We can't hope that somehow kids will put their what they're learning at youth group or in church together with what they're learning at school and say, oh, we need to put these two things together. They need to be seen to be together. And I think there are models to do that. And if I share my screen again, you see, I would argue that this sort of approach with kids is quite critical. From a biblical Christian viewpoint, we need to be encouraging young people to look at what's happening in the world, what's happening around them, and apply their learning and their knowledge and their wisdom to all of those things. And the first thing they need to do, because what we're finding in the world at the moment is it's a tough place for kids, because in the world at the moment, there are some significant issues in contemporary thinking, and most of that is now being seen in the polarization of thought. You're either for something or you're against something. In the US, it's either pro-Trump or anti-Trump. It's either pro this or anti this, and our social media feeds are confirming all of that. All these algorithms that give us stuff that confirm our biases already. And so we live in a world that is very binary, is very black and white, in a world that isn't like this. And so we end up with all these groups of people who are full of anger and outrage. And I think one of the biggest problems facing us in education and the world is a lack of debate, discussion, and conversation. It just doesn't happen anymore. And I think we need to help our kids to be people who engage in debate, discussion, and conversation. And I think this is a model that can do that. Let me go through it quickly. I think we need to help our kids to celebrate. They need to look around them and say, what are the good things in life? This is God's creation, What is good about what's going on? Because there's a tendency that if we don't celebrate things, we become cynical, we become despairing, and so on. And I think celebration is an antidote to cynicism. So we need to, first of all, to say, kids, what's worth celebrating in life? And how do I add my knowledge and my understanding to cause more celebration? I think we'd need to teach our kids to cry. It's a strange thing to say, but we need to teach our kids to be sad. There should be no sadder kids than kids who come from Christian families. They should be able to, because they know what the world should be like. They know what the future promise is, right? And so we need to help our kids to be sad about situations. And I don't mean modern day sentimentalism. I don't mean a focus on woe is me, poor me. I mean to look at the issues in life and to be saddened by those. Then we need to teach them how to critique what's going on, how to analyze, things like the issues of climate change, the issues of racism. How do we critique those things using our learning and our knowledge and our ability? How do we critique those things and then confront things that are wrong, confirm those things that are right, congratulate those people who are doing good things, and then lastly, to realize that we are meant to be countercultural, that we are meant to be coveting this Christ-like community. We're meant to be a light on a hill. We're meant to be salt and light in the world. If we don't teach this, how's it going to happen? Okay.
Yeah.
I nearly got carried away.
Well, that's fine. And even if you did, I don't mind. But yeah, so that's a very, I think, holistic and good way to kind of frame what it is that our children and even we, myself, because I wasn't a child too long ago, what I experienced throughout my educational life, right? Because I've been in secular schools and Christian schools, and back, like what we celebrate, what we cry about, what it is, what kind of vision of society that we have is definitely shaped by these institutions, even by the secular ones that claim to have no allegiance to any religious kind of faith, right? So from that model, though, it seems like the only possible way that a child could be educated and have that directed in a faithful way is if they go to a Christian institution. Now, let me push back by throwing this stat at you. In this 2018 study about the spirituality of youth in Indonesia, it found that of those people who identify themselves as being highly spiritual, there is very little to no difference of the percentage of people within a certain class of those who identify themselves as highly spiritual in secular or Christian schools. So, you're describing this glorious kind of like value for Christian education, but on the other hand, the data questions its efficacy.
I think. Okay, let's look at that. Let's imagine that it is true that divorce is increasing. Not only is divorce increasing in the secular world, it's increasing in the Christian world. Let's imagine that people are leaving the church in droves. Not only is that happening in Western cultures, it's happening in some Asian cultures now too. So if divorce is becoming more normal, does that mean we abandon marriage? If people are leaving the church, does that mean we abandon church? All of our institutions are horribly imperfect. And when we do data studies, I always want to know who wants this study to occur. What's the sort of questions that we ask? Why is the study? It's my why, where, who, how, what again? Why is this study taking place? Where is it going? What is it? What are the expected outcomes? Who is involved? What are the questions? And so on. Every institution is faulty. The church is faulty, right? Why do we attend a Christian church, though? Because we want to provide an environment where there is the potential for growth, right? The potential for development, the potential for understanding. Does that mean every single person who goes to Covenant City Church will become, is guaranteed to become a 100% better disciple of Christ? No, of course it doesn't. But does that mean you give up? But does that mean you give up? But here comes the question. I mean, I don't want to question the authenticity of that research because I don't know, right? But research always has a purpose, research is designed to prove whatever you decide you want your research to prove. That's the way it is. I have no doubt at all, though, that not all kids who go to Christian schools grow in their faith as a consequence, just as not all people who go to a church grow in their faith as a consequence. But we must provide the environment where that becomes a greater possibility, right? Maybe we talked last time about the sort of 4 stages of development, and the 4th stage of development is really making up your own mind about where you are with faith. And I think sometimes where a church community, for example, is very straightforward about what Christian faith is, what Christian belief is, that may well have the effect of turning people off, right? It may well have the effect of that person saying, "Oh, that's too over the top for me. I'm out of here." And I think a Christian school may well have the same effect. And I've had situations in schools of which I've been a part where parents have come to me and said, "Oh, you're far too you're far too evangelical. You're far too strong on this God thing. That's not what I'm looking for." And I say, "That's fine. Not a problem. We're not for everybody. We're here actually to support families who want that development, not families who don't." And so, but I think the question is, would I want to send my child to a place of learning that is opposed to God? Remember what we've said so far. All education is driven by some sort of narrative or story of how we understand life, right? Let me just look at one aspect of that about what is human dignity and what is human value, right? We're just going through in Australia this week 2 major issues which relate to the value of human life. One of them is about the issue of abortion, and in South Australia, the state in which I live, there is debate now of enabling abortion until the 40th week of pregnancy. In other words, until the day before a child may be born, that child may be aborted. Now, here we have a view of the sacredness of life that says that life has no value, or that life has a value that can be determined by somebody else. And I think I mentioned to you last time around that I read a few weeks ago about the whole issue of in 10 years' time, there will be no longer any Down syndrome kids. And I thought, wow, they've discovered a cure. No, they haven't discovered a cure. There's now a pre-birth test that predicts whether your child will be Down syndrome or not. And if they're going to be born with Down syndrome, the strong advice from medical authorities is abort your child. Now, so this view of human life is very different. One says innate dignity, innate value, and one says earned dignity, earned value. They are significantly different points of view. And you know, it actually contributes to the way that we see education. That the student who achieves well has more value than the student who doesn't. Now, that's blatantly false when you look at it from a biblical Christian viewpoint, right? So these things occur. So all education is driven by a narrative, was my first point, and education is holistic. 40 years ago, my youngest son was 5 years of age. He was coming up to needing to start school. And Maureen and I had a discussion. We said we were fairly new Christians at the time. We'd only been Christians for 3 or 4 years. And Matthew was coming up to 5. We thought, where are we going to send him to school? And my understanding of the philosophy of education, of Christian education, was so foundationally simple. It was, I do not want my son taught by somebody who doesn't know Christ the way I know him. It was that simple. And as a consequence, let me see if I have that picture. There is a picture of me back in 1980, me with the blue circle around my head, and Matthew, our 5-year-old, with the circle around his head. We started a school. And I've got to be careful how I say this in the Indonesian context, because if I say I started a school for Indonesian people, that means I own the school and I ran it as a business. No, I didn't. It belonged to the local church, and I was employed by the local church, and I was paid $1,000, not a week or a month, but a year, for the first 3 years of this school's operation. And we started with 24 kids, and there they are. And the commitment of those parents. You see, there was no Christian school around, so I started one, and there was a long process about knowing what God's calling was to do that. And that school grew over the next 16 years into 2 campuses and 800 kids. But my simple philosophy of education was, I want my child taught by somebody who knows Christ in the same way that I do. It was as simple as that for me.
Yeah. And I definitely can gravitate towards a lot of that, right? Especially in relation to how like we can't take for granted the people and our classmates if you want to send your kids to like in-person school now, right? Like their cultural background, their family culture, and all of that comes in. And interesting, you talk about the developmental stages of the child, right? Like right when like the child wants to belong, it makes a huge influence, right, on how they're going to be in future. But I guess in my kind of like question, it would be I want, let's say I want someone to tutor my child math.
Yep.
I honestly don't care as much in terms of whether or not I'm hiring them as a tutor, whether or not they know Jesus, rather than whether or not they can actually teach calculus. And
but you're saying either or there again.
I'm not saying that they're mutually exclusive. If you can find someone who can do both, then that is a blessing from the Lord, right? But when, like, not even in education, right? Like, if I want a plumber, you know, um, let's say there are 2 equally good plumbers. One is a Christian, one isn't. They can fix my toilet exactly to the same competence.
Yeah.
But this guy is a little cheaper and he lives closer by, like, so I want the guy who does my plumbing properly, even though I can evangelize to him, maybe. I can justify myself doing that. But you see, when I think a lot of people would push back though on things like math, for example.
Yeah.
Being not neutral, right? Like 1 + 1 = 2 objectively. And I would want
We
someone
do
who.
realize that 1 + 1 = 2 objectively is not true globally. It is actually true in certain parts of the world. It's not true in certain other parts of the world, but we haven't got time to go into that. Read Poythress's Christian approach to mathematics teaching, and I'm afraid it's not an easy and enjoyable read, but it but it does point out that those what we believe are axiomatic truths are not actually generally accepted in certain parts of the world. But that's a side issue at the moment. I think the difference for me is, can a plumber be a good plumber irrespective of their faith? Yes, of course they can. But we're not talking about plumbers. We're talking about education. We're talking about the intentional development of young people's thinking and ability. Right? We're not talking about their occupation. We're talking about the development of their thinking and their understanding of the world. And again, we have to go back to the biblical statements. I mean, Psalm 145, for example, talks about one generation shall commend your works to another. Okay, you might say, let me push back on your behalf there. We might say, well, that's a parent's job or the church's job to point that out. Okay. A parent, how frequently are parents doing that, and what time do they have? Remember, we started off by saying parents don't have a lot of time to spend with their kids. We live in this economic globalized world now where frequently both parents are working, kids have to go to a school or institution. So you must expect that school or institution to be reinforcing what otherwise you would have done as a parent, right? That's the critical issue, and when I come back to this neutrality, you might say, well, in this school, for example, God is neither talked about nor not talked about. In other words, there's a neutrality. Okay, if we say God is irrelevant to this issue, what we're saying is he doesn't exist, right? If he's irrelevant, it's the same as saying he has no part to play in this. He has no part to play in anything. The outcome's the same. Good Reformed theologian, educator Norman de Jong said that, how do we measure the quality of education? And he said the quality of education must be measured by its proximity to truth. And then if we extrapolate that, so he says the quality of education must be measured by its proximity to Christ. On that simple, rational level, it makes sense, right? But as we said before, schools are intentional places of learning. 20,000 hours of intentionality will go into every kid from the age of 4 through to the age of 18. 20,000 hours of intentional pressure. And no teacher goes into a classroom and says, kids, don't take any notice of me. I'm just here to decorate the place, right? No teacher says that. Every teacher goes into a classroom and says, I want to change the way you think. I want to change the way you act. I want to change the way you feel. I want to change the way you behave. That's incredible intentionality. And let me just tell you a story, because I think I said before that experience is not our only teacher, but it is a teacher. I went to school in the UK. And my senior school was a grammar school. In other words, it was a place of strong academic learning. My religion teacher was an atheist, which is most odd. But he was an incredibly charismatic atheist, charismatic in the sense of he was attractive, able to communicate, great personality, and so on. He spent 3 years with us at high school. And by the end of that 3 years, I was convinced that God did not exist. that everything could be explained either through science or geography or some other rational basis could explain what every Christian was claiming was simply God. I believed him. I totally believed him. It transformed my life. And the effect of a determined, intentional teacher is mammoth. And for the next 10, 12 years of my life, I believed him.
Yeah. Yeah, that must have given you some views that you would take back right now. Yeah.
And it wasn't until I got to university, and well, it was after I went to university actually, because at university I was very much a Paul character. I used to terrorize the local Christian group. There was a Christian group at the university. I used to terrorize them. I used to break into their meetings. I used to tell them how pathetically weak they were, how they needed this crutch of Christ when in fact they should be standing on their own 2 feet. And I thought I was wise, in that. But I was the foolish one, right? And this whole concept of wisdom, which we haven't got to, and maybe that's session 3. This whole thing about how we need to develop in young people. There's this difference between we live in a Google world, and in Google world we can find data and we can find information. That's not knowledge. It's data and information. What Google does for us is find information quickly. It doesn't teach us anything because data is just stuff, right? Information is stuff that can be collected together in a box. Stuff about cars becomes information, right? But from data and information, we then get to knowledge, and knowledge is something that changes us. It so impacts our thinking that it actually changes what we do. And so I gain knowledge, and as a consequence, it changes the way I live and I do stuff, right? Understanding, this is my definition, understanding becomes how do I apply that knowledge in new situations? And wisdom then becomes how do I apply that knowledge and understanding in ways that God calls me to. In other words, in the knowledge of who God is. That's why Paul talks about, the wisdom. We cannot have wisdom unless we know God. And so this progression of data, information, knowledge, understanding, wisdom, surely our desire for our kids is that they will have wisdom. And the only way that they can have wisdom is if their knowledge and understanding is in the context of who God is.
Yeah. I would love
Am
to.
I making my case?
I am. You are, and I'm starting to be compelled. And I would love to have this discussion with you about educate about wisdom and understanding, because I think the Bible, especially Book of Proverbs, has a lot about that. But that's a teaser maybe for later in part 3.
Yeah.
But, so okay, granted, right? Let's say ideally you're educated in a place where your educators have the same kind of commitment to the centrality of God as you do.
Yep.
But there are 2 issues that I wanna raise simultaneously here. Like, one issue is the fact that sometimes we cannot find such schools that would do that, or we cannot afford them for some reason, or for some reason that's just not an option to us.
Yep.
Another part of that scenario is that, does that imply that we want to keep our children in this Christian bubble until they're ready to engage? Because once they're done being educated, formally at least, you throw them out into the wilderness, right? Into the
No, you see, language is fascinating. That why do you presume that there's a bubble? Why do you presume that somehow there is a fortress and a wall around this Christian education institution? Is church a bubble?
Could be.
It could be, right? But and I think there are distinctively different Christian schools, and that's why it is not enough to say I'm going to send my kid to a Christian school because it calls itself a Christian school. There are, for me, there are lots of different sorts, but they generally fall into two categories: the protectionist. We want to keep sin out of our school, and all of our kids inside are innocent and holy and wonderful, and we need to protect them from awful things like rock music and Harry Potter and all of all of this sort of stuff, right? Well, that's rubbish. No, you can't do it. Sin comes to school in the shape of a student or a teacher, or we can't keep sin out. It's in us, right? And I used to say to parents, they said, "Oh, well, I'm sending my kid to your school because it will be a place where, they will not do bad things." I said, "Well, if your child comes and is able to do that, it'll be the first student we've ever had who's able to do that, right?" It's just nonsensical. And so a valid Christian school says not only do we teach in terms of seeing everything through the lens of who God is, but we're engaged. We're engaged with everything. There is nothing that's off limits. There is no question that should not be considered. And I think I've mentioned before, I got a friend who's a principal of a school system in Hong Kong. And he says, we not only want to run the best schools in Hong Kong, we want to run the best schools for Hong Kong. In other words, the sending my child to a Christian school is not just for the benefit of my child. It is to support what I want to do as a parent. But if that school is not encouraging my kid to be engaged in the wider community, it's not the sort of school I want to send my child to. It's if a church is not having an impact on the community in which it exists and beyond, there is something wrong. And so I dispute the terminology of there being a bubble. I think protectionist schools are bubbles, yes, and I would avoid them because I don't think that's the right thing to be doing. It has to be, how do we engage with the community?
Right. Yeah. And that's really a refreshing, I would say, perspective, Mr. Brian, because um, the stigma with a lot of Christian schools. Okay, let me just confess. My Christian school took my Pokemon cards and burned them when I was in like 5th grade, and I'm still kind of bitter about that. Just so people know, okay, I worked hard for my Pokemon cards, but so that's kind of the vision though of a Christian school, right? Where it just teaches you to conform of like to this mold that what they say is a biblical person.
No, you see, I would dispute that that's a biblical Christian school. That's a Pharisaical school. And I think there are lots of Pharisaical schools around. And I think the biggest danger for a Christian school is it will drop into that Pharisaical mold. But it's the biggest danger for a church too, that it will become about behaviors as opposed to the refreshing in the gospel.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So there is a way for there to be liberal, like not in an American sense, right? Like liberal as in
Yeah.
free and
Yeah.
open learning with uh Christian ethics and worldview um inform like not, not even coexisting, but informing that, but not in a
Yes.
way that's restrictive and dismissive of the other kind of point of view, right?
Yeah.
That is possible.
Yeah. It's the difference between conforming and transforming. That it's light on a hill and salt and light in the community. That's the purpose. And this idea of creating a bubble or a conforming community, it's not even possible. You know, this idea of keeping sin out. Well, come on, that's theology 001, right?
I mean, the Amish try very hard to do so. I doubt any Amish are listening to this. So, but
Yeah, but you know, I think we need to be careful there too. You know, to the Amish community have a reputation. I'm not sure it's the truth. It's like the Puritans have a reputation, but I'm not sure it's the truth. Puritans had this reputation for, you know, we don't like anything that makes us smile, you know. Uh, so, but that's not true. You read the Puritans, you find there's incredible joy there.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
So that's a very high bar, right, for the school that we want for our kids. Okay, and okay, so how do we find?
okay, but let me
Yeah,
stop you there. Do we not have a high bar for our church communities?
we do.
And we
We do.
don't necessarily attain that, but do we aim for that high bar? Yes, we do.
Yeah, certainly we do.
And I
Um,
think the difference, the prime difference between a Pharisaical conformist school and a transformative and a school that's trying to expose the whole of the happenings of the world in a godly perspective, the prime difference between those two schools is understanding the grace of God.
yeah,
That's the big difference.
yeah, yeah. And so, what if we can't find a school like that? You know what
I
I'm
know.
saying? And with church, like you're not financially committed to us, right? You can move next week and give your offerings elsewhere. But for a school, you pay for the year and you're stuck there. Okay, um, so I think there's a lot of anxiety from especially my friends who are young parents as to where they can send their school. So I guess give us some, like, if it's not available or within the range of their financial affordability, what should they do? And what can we do as the community and as parents themselves to supplement where perhaps an educational institution might be less than ideal?
I think um, there are all sorts of reasons as to why we might not be able to. Let's presume that what I'm saying is that a good transformational, grace imbibed, gospel centered Christian school is a good option. Is it the only option? No. It may not be an option for families because there is no school like that within traveling distance. It might not be an option because there's no school like that that is affordable. It may not be an option because the only schools that call themselves Christian are these bubble schools that we're talking about that will actually do more harm than good. So what do we do if no such institution is available? By the way, before we move on from that, the big danger about sending our kids to a Christian school is that we now think we've done our job, and we haven't. We must not give up on our responsibility for the nurture and development of our kids. It is still our primary responsibility as parents. It is not the school's job. The school is only ever there to assist parents in that process. And so if we say, oh, I've sent my kids to a Christian school, I don't need to worry about them now, is just false. It's not valid. If I can't find a Christian school, I have to ask serious questions about the school that I'm sending my kids to. My why, where, who, how, what questions need to be asked. And I think it's every school needs to see that they are a support agency, not an agency that replaces parents. In other words, parents must have the confidence to go to a school and say, what do you think about this? What do you think about the importance of parents in the education of their children? What does the curriculum at your school, what's the center of that curriculum? What is the what is at the heart of the curriculum? What is it that you're teaching my child? I need to know. And to ask those questions of school communities, to ask the questions like, what's at the center of the curriculum pedagogy? What attitudes, behaviors, and goals will you try to imbue into the life of my child, and why? How does the curriculum and what your teachers will teach my child encourage them to relate positively to other people? In other words, to ask significant questions about that school, and then to engage in ways that are formal and informal, to become part of the parents group of that school, and to suggest ways that education might be improved. Now, a school is not there to simply respond to a democratic parent model, but you can influence what goes on, and you must ask questions about what is my child being taught, so that I know whether there are things that I need to redress in our family situation. And I need to make sure that I'm going to spend significant time with my kids redressing some of those situations, not in an approach that says what your school's teaching you is entirely wrong and we hate the school because of that, because the child needs to be part of that community, right? But how do I compensate for the different viewpoints and so on in a positive way? Do you follow? We don't want to turn our kids against the school community that they're in, and we as parents need to be influential in that school and to be supportive of that school community, but question and critique, just like we are teaching our kids to do. So it's not a hidden, it's not a lost cause, right? And every parent has to make that decision. And they have to make that decision prayerfully and before God, and say, it is better for me that I be involved in a local community where I have some influence, and I compensate, or I redress those issues that I think are maybe a little bit edgy with my child, by spending time with them. And I do that in the most positive and encouraging way possible, so I'm not driving a wedge between the school community and my child's thinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I'm hearing that even though, let's say, we as parents, I'm not a parent, but if I was a parent, um, don't fully agree with the school's views on whatever, right?
Yeah.
There's still plenty of opportunity for me to
Yeah.
participate in that schooling kind of like system, and and to not think that like just sending your kids to the school or just picking the school itself is the end of the job,
That's right.
but also kind of like participating in that,
Yeah.
and influencing, and being influential and active and engaged in that too.
I think we need to be aware of falling into the triumphalist trap of thinking I send my child to a government school to be an evangelist. It honestly rarely does that work. A few years ago, I met a guy who was actually an elder of one of the churches that we were associated with. It wasn't a church I went to, but he was an elder of this local church, and I had some engagement with them. And he just retired, and he said, I'd spent 30 years in this particular business, and he says, I've just retired, and we had a retirement party, and guess what? I discovered that the guy that I've been working with for 30 years was also a Christian. And so for 30 years, he'd worked side by side with this guy, and they had no idea that each of them were Christian people. Let's face the truth. We as adults are pathetic in terms of our Christian witness in secular environments. We cannot put that pressure on our kids. All that will happen is that they will be ostracized, they will be rejected. Yes, they need to live in a way that honors Christ, but they're not there to be evangelists. Schools are not designed for students to influence what the school teaches. That's what teachers do, right? Can they influence by the way that they live, by the way that they relate to other people? Yes, they can. But please don't think that, you know, I'm making this decision to send my kid into this school as an evangelist. It's terminal. You're sending your kid to final death.
Right. Yeah. Off to the wilderness. You know what I mean? And yeah. That evangelism is hard for adults to do. Impossible outside of the Holy Spirit, actually.
Yeah.
And yeah, that I could imagine just would send your kids to a place where they would be more conflicted.
Yeah.
Which is what happens actually, having been from a Christian school, right? Like for my friends who don't come from Christian backgrounds,
Yeah.
get sent to Christian schools, right? Before they leave, they're like, their parents tell them explicitly, don't take the religious stuff too seriously.
Yeah.
You know, that's we don't believe in that. I don't believe in that. But you know, just pass it, tolerate it. You know, basically
Yeah.
is their advice, but don't take it seriously at all. And yeah, that disjunction between what the school is trying to do and the values of that parents ultimately kind of messed up the value that they gain or they could have gained from being in an environment that is intentionally aligned to how you view the world.
Yeah. We must be running out of time, and this obviously means we need to do chapter 3 at some point.
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I guess in summary, every set of parents needs to ask some critical questions when they're considering schooling. What are the top priorities in terms of education of your children? And you own that. And if the top priority is to get to Harvard, that's your parental choice, right? I would argue that for a biblical Christian thinker, that is probably, you know, it's a disordered situation, but it's a right of a parent to make that decision. What do you hope for your kids by the time they graduate? You know, if you sit down and think, what would we ideally like to see our 17, 18-year-old son or daughter? How would we like to see them? And is this school able to provide an environment where that could be encouraged, and the chances of that occurring will be enhanced, right? So it's that sort of question. What am I willing to commit to in terms of in getting involved in the school community of which my child is a part, whether that's a Christian school or a government school or some other basis of a school? To what time and money effort am I prepared to get engaged in? How important is a biblical world and life view? And if I'm not going to get that at school, how do we do that as a family or as a group of families together? How do we enhance that in the lives of our kids? So they're those sorts of questions that I think we need to ask.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good and practical note to end our program here. Went a little over time, but I had too much fun and there was a lot of material to go through. And so if any of you guys still have any questions on Christian education, this is by no means a closed discussion. We will welcome any of you guys to send in questions to covenantcdc@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram at Covenant City Church. Yeah, and just let us know if you enjoyed this conversation and if you have any questions. If there are questions, we might do a question and response video after that. So thank you for your time, and in proper Christian manner, Mr. Brian, can I ask you to pray us out? Yeah.
Sure can. Actually, there's a verse in Romans 15:13 that I pray for my grandchildren every day, and I think it's a good prayer for parents to pray in the lives of their kids. So Romans 15:13 says, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope." Amen.
Amen. Amen. All right. Thank you guys. See you next time.
God bless you.